Well, who doesn't love a Christmas pageant? I'm not sure I was ever actually in one, but I do very vividly remember getting to play the little drummer boy in 4th grade, which really thrilled my tomboy heart. And I've always loved Christmas pageants in church. They are the perfect recipe. The perfect recipe for warming our hearts during this cold and dark season. They have just, I think, the right combination of pathos, cuteness, nervousness of parents as well as children, seriousness, and glorious unpredictability. They portray the birth of Jesus with the charm of a nativity scene come to life. You have the loving and doting Mary, gentle, protective Joseph, singing angels and wondering shepherds. And it doesn't matter if the halos fall off or the shepherds bicker or the baby Jesus gets dropped, because we all know the story behind the story by heart. And the little tableau paints a picture of this perfect nuclear family in loving harmony, joyful, and at peace. Well, I love Christmas pageants as much as I love nativity scenes, and I have quite a few of those at home. And I don't want to burst anybody's bubble or take away that warm, cozy Christmas glow, but if we're honest, even a close reading of the Bible forces us to realize that nativity scenes and Christmas pageants are more like historical fiction than they are documentary. I think pageants should come with that kind of disclaimer that you sometimes see at the end of a really good movie. This story is based on actual events. In certain cases, incidents, characters, and timelines have been changed for dramatic purposes. Certain characters may be composites or entirely fictitious. Well, I think the writer of Matthew's Gospel would appreciate the disclaimer. Matthew is under no illusions about perfect families, even when it comes to Jesus. I know this because of the way Matthew chooses to begin his gospel. Unlike the other gospels, and I encourage you to look and see how each of the 4 gospels chooses to begin the story of Jesus. But unlike those other gospels, Matthew begins with the Ancestry.com version of Jesus' origins. What he calls the genealogy, or actually, if you look at the Greek word, it's the Genesis of Jesus. And unlike the mystical Word made flesh of the Gospel of John, or those endearing stories of Elizabeth and Mary in Luke, we get what appears to be a dry recitation of names, generations of names that preceded Jesus, but names that tell us something about Jesus and ultimately about God. Now, we almost never, as I'm sure you've noticed, read the genealogy when we read the Advent story of the birth of Jesus in Matthew, because genealogies are boring, unless maybe they're yours. But if you look carefully at what is hidden in the contours of Matthew's genealogy, you might find some startling revelations, ones that take a little bit of biblical literacy to recognize. As Susan Andrews, who is quoted on the cover of our bulletin, writes, "Gentiles being welcomed, sinners being changed, transgressions nurturing transformation, fear fueling courage. It is out of a ghastly, goodly heritage that Jesus is born. Believe it or not, we learn all that just from reading those dry names at the beginning of Matthew. Because among those dry names, 4 in particular stand out. Did you notice? The names of 4 women break the desert of female ancestors of Jesus. In fact, usually women aren't mentioned at all in these ancient patriarchal genealogies. But 4 women's names are mentioned, and these women have behind them stories that represent quite a departure from the norm of the perfect so-called biblical family. It turns out there are some scandalous skeletons in Jesus' family closet, if you have the eyes to see them. Let's take Tamar, the daughter-in-law of Judah, who tricked him into fulfilling his obligations under Jewish law to give her a child after her husband died. You have Rahab, the Gentile prostitute, who hid Israelite spies, betraying her own people before the Battle of Jericho. And so her family was saved and incorporated into the family of Israel. And of course, you have Bathsheba, whose name is not mentioned, but who is known by the moniker wife of Uriah here. Uriah, the general of David, whom David had killed so he could take Uriah's wife Bathsheba for himself. And then you have Ruth, the faithful Gentile who left her homeland and her gods to follow her mother-in-law back to Israel, where she won Naomi's kinsman's heart and hand in marriage, becoming an ancestress of Jesus. Now, within these women's stories, we find the stories of the men who abandoned and reclaimed them, who raped them and protected them. These are not G-rated stories, but they are the real stories of Jesus' ancestors. Now, when Joseph is convinced by the angel to take Mary as his legal wife and to offer her child the protection of his name, this is the legacy he lays on Jesus. This is how Jesus becomes the son of David, by the mercy of a fearful and reluctant Joseph, who saves Mary from the scandal and real danger of being an unwed mother. It is out of a ghastly, goodly heritage that Jesus is born. That ghastly and goodly heritage is a pretty good description of my family, maybe of yours too. It comforts me to know that Jesus didn't come from a perfect family. In fact, it gives me hope for the whole human family. I often have noticed that when I am in gatherings of other activists, of those who are on the front lines working on causes for justice or peace or the environment, people are often talking proudly about the families they come from, about their parents or grandparents who were civil rights activists, who took them to rallies from the time they could walk, who taught them to demonstrate and fight for what is right. And I don't know, I'm sure these are authentic stories, but sometimes I feel like the odd person out. Because these families were not my family. I love my parents, and in many, many ways, they are wonderful people. Salt of the earth, honest as the day is long, kind to strangers and friends alike. But activists, they are not. And in my family tree, as I have begun to learn, there were slave masters. There were slave overseers. There were white settlers who pushed into so-called Indian territory in perpetuity in Oklahoma and turned it into a state for white settlers. I'm sure I come from more than one alcoholic, and as my parents finally told me in hushed tones after I was an adult, I come from at least one illegitimate child in my ancestry. And I don't come from a particularly dysfunctional family. But I don't come from a family of angels either. I come from a family of pretty ordinary Americans who reflect our greatest vices and our greatest virtues. I bet you come from a family like that too. And so, how comforting is it to know that into families just like ours, Jesus was born? So on this fourth Sunday of Advent, on the second darkest day of the year, as we approach the miracle of Christmas, here's my takeaway. While the angel tells Joseph that Jesus shall be called Emmanuel, God with us, Jesus' genealogy tells us what that really means. The birth of Jesus means God with us in our addicted families, God with us in our broken families, God with us in our abused families and abusive families, God with us in our estranged families, God with us in our racist families, God with us in and through every family into which we are born. Because God chooses to become flesh in the worst of us as well as the best of us. And that is the good news of Christmas. God with us in Jesus means God with us in our darkest corners and deepest closets. God finding us in spite of and because of our flawed origins. God with us means there is no place that God's love cannot break through. No story without hope, no family that is without the potential for a new Genesis, a new beginning. As Ben Stewart, worship professor at a Lutheran seminary in Chicago, has said, at its deepest level, I think the Christmas gospel tells the story of God's entrance into this world from the underside. And when all of us gather there together, and the marginalized are in the center, that's the promise of Christmas. So bring out your skeletons and throw open your closet doors, friends. God isn't ashamed of them. Why should you be? There's grace and love enough for the worst of us and the worst of our ancestors, for even in the worst stories, God is actively at work, loving and luring out the possibilities for goodness, compassion, wholeness, and yes, redemption. Thanks be to God, for love came down at Christmas. Amen.